Hello and welcome to Raggy Paints. This week I'm going to show you how to take your resin bases to the next level. So this week I'm painting up some bases for my bolt-action Soviet army, and it turns out in World War II the Soviets were still using trench warfare tactics, and I went ahead and picked up some of the trenchworks bases that Elrix does, but being a Soviet army, I really wanted to give them the feel of a colder climate, and for that we wanted snow effects. So in this video I'm going to show you how I achieved that, what I did, the processes and the steps I took, as well as a little bit of the thinking behind how I get to these stages. And once again, I'm using Elrix Hobbies bases, and if you would like to try them out for yourself, there is an affiliate link in the description below with a code that will give you a discount of 10%, and it will help me and the channel out as well. So please consider checking that out if you're interested in getting yourself some really nice resin bases. Hopefully you'll enjoy it, and I will see you shortly. Just as with the Martian Earth bases in my previous tutorial, we're starting with black primed bases and applying a white zenithal at an oblique angle to try and exaggerate the shadows from the flattened surfaces. Just as last time, I'm using Pro-Acryl's Bold Titanium White for this step. Having done that, we're applying a coat of Vallejo Model Color Green Ochre for the wood onto the surfaces of the model. This is to give the wooden sections their base color. We're going to work on this a little bit further to increase the depth, but in this pass it's a slightly opaque paint, so it is going to kill off some of that contrast from the zenithal. We don't want that to happen too much, but we do want to make sure that we've covered all of the white highlighted areas. Just as last time, you'll see that I'm not quite as cautious about the angles that I'm spraying at here and giving it more of an all-over coat. Next stage is to start painting up the exposed dirt and earth. We're going to keep this a pretty dark color. I'm using burnt umber as the base for this, and the reason for going a darker color is because this is going to be wet, sodden earth in line with the snow effects that are to come later. We're going to be building this up to really be an accurate rendition of what we'd see in real life. Now, I'm being careful to cover all of the earth sections, but I'm not worried about this hitting any of the wooden sections above. And the reason for that is that this mud would stain the wood in places in any case. Having quickly done that, the next step is to increase the depth and the contrast a little bit further, and we're doing this in two separate washes effectively. I'm using Daler-Rowney FW inks of black and of sepia. So the sepia ink wash thinned down is going on to the wooden areas to help bring out the grain, and we'll further exaggerate that in a later step. The black ink is being applied to the wet earth to really dull it down and shift it a little bit into the blue spectrum, as we'd expect with, very wet earth. Note that I am thinning these inks quite heavily. I'm not looking to provide too much coverage or to shift the tone of the areas overall that extensively. I really do want this to be much more like a wash than a stain. This is quite a manual process. I'm trying to be fairly accurate here, particularly with the sepia sections, to make sure that I'm not providing too much warmth to the earthen areas. What you'll see, and this is something that I often do when I'm applying washes or even contrast paints, I tend to try and put quite a lot of the paint on the surface of the model right at the beginning, and then move that big kind of dollop of paint around with the brush quickly but accurately. This helps me move everything and color everything before it's really started drying, and without me having to go back to the pot and get more and so on, which can lead to instances where the paint has started drying in parts before I've finished covering an area. It's obviously a more pronounced step to take with larger pieces like this or with terrain than when you're just coloring the small area of a miniature itself. After leaving that step to dry, which takes a little bit of time obviously, as washes generally do, it's now time to really bring out some of the finished effect that I want for these surfaces. And to do that, I'm doing two different processes. The first is to dry brush the wooden decking with a green ochre, bringing it back up to the brighter colors. And this also helps further exaggerate the grain of the wood. Another nice thing about using cast resin bases is you've got a lot of texture to work with, which makes dry brushing very quick and very effective to give a lot of dimension to the bases. Having done that step, the next process is to paint over all of the earth areas with a gloss varnish. And what this does is it gives the shiny effect of wet earth. Now, if you are wanting to give the bases a little bit of added protection, I would recommend spraying on a matte varnish first and then painting on the gloss varnish after. I have not worried about doing this, as I don't think these bases are going to really need it. As usual with resin bases, I was careful to clean and scrub them before I applied the primer, so the paint should adhere pretty well. With the gloss varnish applied, we can leave that to dry, and honestly we can call the bases done at this point, just put the black rim on them. If you're wanting to add some static grass or some grass tufts, then I would suggest doing that at this point in the process before we start applying the snow effects on top of them, so that it feels like they're really part of the environment. Given this is a blasted, war-torn trench environment, I did not want to introduce the element of grass tufts. It didn't seem appropriate. Once again, I wait for that layer to dry. The gloss varnish takes a little bit of time to dry, and the next step here is really kind of my secret to snow basing, and that is Vallejo's water texture. And this stuff dries a little bit frosty almost. It's meant for replicating kind of the white surf on water effects, but because of that it holds volume, it holds shape pretty well, and it's slightly adhesive, so that we can start applying some of the snow flocking to it. Now you'll see exactly what type of snow flocking I have in the next scene, but this is Gale Force Online snow flock, I believe. The nice thing about this stuff is because it dries with that slightly coloured texture, it actually does look like kind of frosted, slushy water, which is just perfect for a well-trodden snow environment where you've kind of crushed the powdery snow a little bit, but it's so thick on the ground that you've not necessarily cleared through it all. So it gives a really satisfying effect. And at this stage, once it's dry and you've tapped off the excess, you can really stop. Again, this just looks like frosted earth, snow that's fallen in the previous few days, started melting, refrozen overnight. This is really quite a good impression of that effect. For these, however, I wanted to go a little bit further, and so we're going to apply an additional pass of the flock, and this time we're just applying it using thinned PVA glue. I actually keep some in a spray bottle for when I'm doing terrain, and I just use the dropper out of the bottle to kind of dab it on in places. I'm not really trying for full coverage here. I'm expecting different parts of the snow to have thawed and melted varying amounts, so just dab it on here and there, let it spread a little bit throughout the base, and then just apply some more of the snow flock effect. What we're doing here is we're really building up the story of how the snow is interacting with the environment. We start off with the earth underneath and the surfaces underneath. We paint those up in effect, and we introduce the moistness that we'd see that wet earth. On top of that, we start applying the frost and the freeze elements of the base, and then on top of that we start laying down the kind of fresh fall snow. And so that is really what we're looking to achieve with this process. And this is what gives it a nice, natural, realistic effect. And it also means that we can stop on varying parts at varying stages of the process to give that variety. Here on this base you can see somewhere it's just that kind of thin frost, somewhere it's more substantive snowfall, and it's still looking a little bit thin. So what I'm using here is a little bit of Pro-Acryl transparent white. If you don't have this, just heavily thin some white paint, and I'm just dabbing that on part of the snow to give it more depth of color, to thicken it up a little bit without having to build up layer after layer of the paint. Here we have the finished effect. You can see different parts of the bases are finished to a different degree, but it really gives you that feeling of a cold environment. Further enhance this by making sure you've got mud splatter on the troops and maybe little bits of snow if it's freshly fallen. starting to build up on the surfaces of their fabric, etc. And that's all there is to it. Really good, realistic snow effects onto resin bases to really take them up another level. Hopefully this is of interest to you and useful. Please do consider liking this video, subscribing, maybe throwing something in the comments. Whatever you can do is really helpful for me and for the channel. And until I see you again, later days.